Part 2, what happened here? I'm going to talk about some approaches to environmental storytelling in the games you're making and in the games you play as you're kind of playing them. Might give you a better appreciation of what's happening there. But I'm sure there will be lots of stuff here that you've thought of before, but maybe some stuff that you haven't. The most simple way of thinking about environmental storytelling is that it is all about where did you put your skeletons. And there are a million memes about Fallout with this. You either perish as a hero or live long enough to become an environmental storytelling skeleton. Which got me to thinking about this question of why do storytellers love apocalypses so much, right? I love apocalypses. I've always been a fan of apocalyptic fiction, even when I was like a little kid. I think there are specific reasons why it fits so well with games, and I'm going to outline them here because it kind of ties together like localized environmental storytelling and big picture world building really well, I think. So this is the timeline that you often get in a lot of post-apocalyptic video games. As a player character, you're over here on the right? This is the irradiated post-apocalyptic world or whatever's wrong with it. And you're going around doing quests. And that in its own right is a lot of story, just the quests that you're doing and whatever you're meeting in the world. But then the developers are also able to tell a story about all of this stuff over here on the left-hand side through that. So you've got stories about the world before and how we deserved the big oopsie, right? And then we've got the big oopsie, whatever apocalyptic event happens that makes the world be all yucky and green. We've got a bunch of story points here that creates like a really rich tableau for telling lots of different types of stories. We've got the quests that the player is currently doing in the world, right? And then we've got stories about what happened to change the world and stories about what the world was like before. And I've sort of presented this in the kind of, nowhere profit mode of a traditional Mad Max post-apocalypse, right? But there are lots of fantasy stories that take this format as well, where there's like a fantasy apocalypse event some point in the deep past that there's called something like the Sundering. Then that, again, it allows us to tell stories about what happened then and what the world was like before it. And I think this is one of the reasons why, aesthetic reasons aside, apocalypses are such a good way of telling stories in games, because we get a big empty world, which, if you think of it from a practical point of view, we can have a world that has some things we recognize from our world, but which is really, really empty, right? So there are some kind of practical dev reasons for that as well. But we also get all of these different, like, scales of story we can tell, which makes it really, really useful and interesting as a storyteller. Danny says, my favorite environmental storytelling cliche is people who are about to die and whipping out a recording device to journal their death. Yeah. And that's definitely where you've got something environmental there and then a text is added as well. And often you don't need the text, right? And it would have been better to just see the skeleton than to see the skeleton and then also read a letter that says, I'm going to become a skeleton. It would have been better to just have the visual on its own. This is an interesting one because we are perceiving what appears to be the remains of a human world, but there are no humans in this game. We are a cat. There are robots we can interact with. Spoilers for Stray. I mean, you meet a robot about 10 minutes in. And the perspective that you get by being the cat is very, very interesting. It gives it a particular sort of melancholy to it. Because when you're playing a human in a post-apocalyptic world, it often feels a bit ham-fisted of like the human either doesn't know anything and doesn't have any opinions about past humans, or they're really preoccupied with it and they've got what they call the old world blues in Fallout and they're really preoccupied with it. The cat is just ambivalent to it in a certain way. Anyone who's played Hollow Knight, but this is what I would think of as very broad environmental storytelling. There is a quality to the environment that changes. Like here it is some sort of infection coming in that is making the general environment seem different. This is a type of environmental storytelling, but it's very broad. It's happening over large areas of the game. And a lot of storytelling that's done through environment is in one of these modes, right? You've got the very specific localized thing of what happened here. In this bathtub, a human became a skeleton. And then on the right, you've got like the Khalid from from Elden Ring type version of something that is broad, is happening across a huge area, and it's kind of what defines the art style and all of the art assets that go into the world, right? Generally speaking, if you're making an indie game and you're doing something with level design, this stuff on the right is going to be easier to achieve. It's generally easier to go, right, I've got 4 areas and the player goes through them, and area 4 is supposed to be more scary and dangerous than area 1. And then you can think of like, why is area 4 more scary and dangerous? Oh, it's haunted, or it's toxic, or, you know, it's got something wrong with it that has happened because of something in the world, right? And this is often like how this very broad strokes environmental storytelling works in games, right? Some of it is to communicate the difficulty of the area, of like, you are going deeper down into hell, so stuff is going to get more hellish. And then the left-hand side is what we see in a lot of Sims. We see this in like Bioshock type games. Lots of games where you're sort of embodied as a character and you're able to look around the world. But in order to be able to do it, we need a lot more assets, right? And that's why you get all of these memes about Fallout games putting skeletons in different places, because it's low-hanging fruit for them. It's quite cheap. They can put dozens of skeletons around their world with different objects around them, and it will kind of tell a different story. Is this skeleton in a bath full of cocaine? What are these white things? I don't know what they're supposed to be, but usually environmental storytelling is kind of happening on one of these extreme ends of the spectrum, and then sometimes you get the big, broad, you know, there was an apocalyptic event here, and then you get these smaller stories dotted around of how someone became a skeleton. Then occasionally you get really good examples of something a bit more rich and interesting. I think this is a really good example. If anyone's played Amnesia Rebirth, very early on in Amnesia Rebirth, you go to this fort, and the fort was previously occupied by members of the French Foreign Legion, Legionnaire here. And there is an area of the fort where you encounter this big ballista that they've built. And the ballista has this winch on it. And you need to find the winch in order to rebuild a lift, because they've taken the winch off of the lift to build this trap with it. So that's a puzzle, right? It's like, I need to get this object to advance. This object is the key that goes into a lock and key puzzle. And the object is a mechanism that should be on the lift that can take me up to the next place I need to go to. But the storytelling here is giving you all the explanation of why this puzzle exists, right? They've taken the mechanism from here to build a trap. Right? They've taken the winch from the lift to build this ballista, this crossbow in the environment. And then that begs the question, why did they do that, right? And you get this a lot in horror games. You get the idea that you are in a threatening area, there is some sort of threat still there, and a lot of what you're going to see is kind of the leftovers of the last people who were there and tried to deal with the threat, right? You get this in Dead Space. You get it in a lot of different horror games where you're the only person left there, or you've come in later after everyone else has died, and you see remnants of the previous struggle that happened there. This one is a really good example of that, because it tells a story about the people who were there before. You know, they did a Home Alone. They built all these traps and barricades trying to deal with the monster. But that story also feeds into the puzzle design, right? So instead of just arbitrarily needing to get an object and it being somewhere else for some reason, we get the full why that thing has been relocated to a different place, right? So this is really, really neat in terms of like wedding the puzzle design and the environmental storytelling. We get a puzzle, we get a reason for the parts of the puzzle being separated from each other, which in most puzzle designs is just arbitrary, right? That the thing we need is over there, and it's just over there for a reason. And the reason it's over there is starting to build the tension about the existence of this monster, which up to this point in the game you have not really met yet. There's so much going on there. And this is an example of what you get when you have a studio that is entirely focused on these things, right? How do I tell a story in an environment? How do I make it scary? And all of that kind of stuff just going together to kind of create this one situation, which is really, really great. Gone Home and games like it have long been talked about in terms of walking simulators, which started out as a sort of derogatory term for these games, and later on has been adopted unironically as the name for these games. I don't think we should call them that. I think we should call them something like just environmental storytelling games, first-person story puzzle games, or something like that. Walking is not the thing you're doing, really. What you're doing is exploring an environment and piecing together a story by, examining that environment and looking at the information there. And that whole genre of walking simulators, if we want to call them that, really comes out of an interesting set of indie development constraints, right? Of like, you've got a studio, you can make a reasonably realistic rendering of a place. It's relatively cheap to do voice acting, but it's not easy to have a character lip sync and stuff like that, which is why so many of these games take the format that they do, right? So we can tell a story in a really interesting way by having an environment you interact with, having documents you interact with, having voice recordings you interact with, and all the time we're trying to avoid having people that are actually there. And that's how you get Dear Esther, it's how you get Gone Home, and it's also how you get some more kind of actively puzzle-focused games like Talos Principle. We need a better name for walking sim. We're never going to get people to call them something else, but I do think it doesn't really do them justice. When you think of what the player is doing in them, moment to moment, to me, it comes down to this question of, like, what is interactivity? And if you think of puzzles and deduction, when people have read detective books, they are engaging with that piece of media in a very active way. They're not just taking every scene as it comes. They're building this like model in their head of the crime and trying to solve the crime themselves, right? That's what people were doing when they were reading the original Sherlock Holmes novels and stuff like that, right? You don't need to be like scribbling on the book to be interacting with it. And I think what a lot of people don't understand with walking simulators, or at least with good walking simulators, is that okay, there might not be a great degree of interactivity in terms of what the player is doing with the buttons in their hands, but they're piecing things together in their head, and that is where the interactivity is. You can say the same things about strategy games, right? When you play a top-down strategy game, the part of it that actually makes it fun is the thing that's happening in your head. That's why it's called a strategy game. The strategizing is the fun thing. And it's the same thing with these types of games. Okay, adding more interactions, like being able to press play on a tape recorder or interact with things physically in a particular way, does make it more fun. But there is a lot of interaction that comes from the questions that the player is forced to ask themselves as they engage with the material in the world, which again is kind of like a micro level version of what I was talking about the difference between history and lore, and why an incomplete history is more interesting, because players enjoy having these kind of questions in their head, right? They enjoy having these unanswered things to mull over. That's what Gone Home does as well. That is what these smaller games do. They put you in an environment which has remnants of stories in, but they don't give you the whole story. And what you're doing as you play them is putting that story together and trying to come to some sort of satisfying conclusion for yourself. And just in case you're thinking, oh, my game is like a really low res 1-bit or 8-bit game, I can't do environmental storytelling, I just wanted to give some props to Minit. Minit is a great little game. It's a sort of Zelda-like top-down game where you die every minute. So the only way you can advance is by collecting items that let you unlock things, or by unlocking new beds so you spawn in a different part of the map. And you can just look at how simple this art style is, but how evocative it is as well. Like, I totally want to live in that little Winnebago and occasionally come outside, lay down in that hammock, sit by the fire with my watering can. It's just so evocative. And that's still environmental storytelling. The way these locations are built, it's done with the most simple art style. It's like that kind of Downwell style 1-bit art style. So I think it's very tempting to see what we usually see referred to as environmental storytelling like this and say, well, I'm just making a really simple top-down action game or a platformer. I can't do this stuff to give it a sense of place because I'm just using tiles or whatever. I think Minit is a very good example of how you can do that on a budget. And some of it comes down to thinking about what objects you draw or include in your kit of tiles or sprites in the first place. Yeah, I mean, that hammock, I don't know if that gets used anywhere else in the game. But this little scene, it kind of gives me a little story in my head about what sort of person lives here and like what their day is like and stuff like that. Unpacking is a game where you play as a young woman growing up and you unpack her stuff in different rooms. The game jumps a few years each time you move into a new house. But I think this is such an interesting case study for games that tell stories without characters in them. It's not like you are a character and you go into a place and you've got a goal and the place is sort of there as a secondary interesting thing of like, oh, what happened here? In Unpacking, that is the entire game. You put the stuff out from the box and it's satisfying to try and put it in the right place. And if you just look at it as a pure game and not a story, then that is all that is happening. Is just like a satisfying interaction of trying to make things fit in a sort of, you know, Tetris Jenga kind of way. But if you take in the layer of like, what do these objects mean? It becomes really, really rich in terms of the story it's telling. You know, the character has collections that change throughout their life. We have, you know, objects that leave that they don't keep and objects that they keep all the way through their life and all of that kind of stuff. Really, really worth a look because I just can't think of a game that does this sort of thing better, really. And then we've got stuff like Hypnospace Outlaw, which I'm including just to get you to think about spaces which we wouldn't conventionally think of as spaces. When does an interface become a place, right? So there's a nice little bit of theory here that links to some of the stuff around environmental storytelling and stuff like walking simulators. Clara Fernandez-Vara, who's like a game studies person, came up with this term called indexical storytelling, which is the idea of using traces and indications to construct a story. Index comes from semiotics, and it basically just means when we have a sign or a symbol which stands in for something else. So an index in semiotics is when you look at something and you know it means something else. But you only know it means something else because you've learnt it, right? So if you see smoke on the horizon, you look at that and you think there is probably a fire underneath that smoke. That is an indexical meaning of the smoke because it's like a secondary meaning that it's not a representation of the actual thing. It's a representation of something related to the thing, right? Discovering footprints on the floor would be another example of an indexical meaning. So this is the idea that we are putting clues in an environment and then the player is receiving those clues and building a story in their head. And the example of the ballista trap from Amnesia would be an example of that, but they kind of spoil it a little bit by putting letters around that explain everything. So I think this is quite a helpful model because it encourages us to think about, you know, we're giving the player clues so they can think about what happened in the environment before and how it left a trace in the space. It's not just the Kaled, the entire land has been nuked by mushrooms kind of thing. It's a little bit more specific than that. How can the player read those traces to reconstruct the events? And again, we're not necessarily thinking about things like letters that are left or the Dead Space thing of a character writes tutorial instructions on the wall with blood. It's much more subtle than that. It's like literally stuff a detective would look for, like, oh, there are drag marks on the floor here, or this area of the room is clean and the other areas of the room aren't. What does that mean? And naturally, it's easy to think of this stuff and think of it as applying mostly to high fidelity 3D games with lots of art assets and lots of detail. But I'm sure you can find examples like where you could apply this to a 2D platformer or something like that as well. And then there's this stuff of like who has been in the space before the player. How does the player relate to the people who left the traces? So think back to our post-apocalyptic examples. We've got, you know, who was in the space recently, who is the same as our player character, who is another sort of post-apocalyptic scavenger or something like that. We've got the, you know, in Fallout, we've got the old-timey 1950s people who were here hundreds of years ago. And you suddenly get all of these echoes through history of how the space has been used by different people and how the purpose of the space has changed. You see this trope a lot in disaster movies, post-apocalyptic movies, where they go somewhere like a school or a hospital. You know, Silent Hill is an example of this. The idea of taking somewhere that is supposed to be a place of safety and flipping it on its head so it's now the total opposite. It's totally unsafe. Right, that is an example of this kind of thing, because we've got a current mood we're trying to create of horror, and deliberately setting that horror in a place that we're supposed to associate with safety kind of makes it more unnerving and makes it creepier. This is all the same sort of stuff of like, how was this place used before, And how does that make the kind of current player character feel, and how is it supposed to make the player feel? All of this kind of stuff. A few things to think about in terms of environmental storytelling. It's not just the big global stuff of when you get nuked by the fungus chungus. It's not just skeletons in baths. It could be a whole game where you are searching the environment for bits of a story and putting them together in your head. Not necessarily clicking them together in an interface and pressing a button, then it goes, "You have correctly interpreted." You don't need that. The sort of people who are interested in stories don't need that, right? You can do environmental storytelling on a budget. You just need to think very carefully about what objects you put into your world and where you put them. When you make clutter objects for your world, think of the storytelling capacity of those objects. Like, don't just make the stuff you think you should make. You can come up with a couple of little dioramas that could exist in your dungeon crawl game or in your platformer game with objects arranged in a particular way that tell a particular type of story. You might design your skeletons to be sat in a particular way that makes it easy for you to put different objects in their hands. So as you advance through your dungeon, you can have two skeletons playing cards. And it's just the same skeleton asset flipped. And then later on, we can have a skeleton sat exactly the same asset, but we can put a fishing rod in their hand. As is always the case with indie development, there are ways of thinking of your workflow or structuring your workflow that make it easier to do this stuff well. So if you think, okay, before I make loads of assets for my game, I'm going to just pencil sketch a couple of little dioramas, and then I'm going to take an object from that diorama, like my skeleton, for example, and say, how can I reuse this in lots of different ways? And in that example, if I sit the skeleton in a particular way, so they're sitting, if we're making a tile-based pixel art game, my skeleton is sitting on a block. And that block can be a chair, or it can be the edge of a wall, or it can be a boulder. And then I'm going to position them so I can place other objects in their hand. And here are all the different objects I can put in their hand. And then suddenly I've got a load of funny little moments for players to happen across. And maybe some poignant moments as well. Maybe some sad feeling moments. Or whatever. It's very easy to avoid doing this kind of stuff because you think, oh, I'm an indie developer, I don't have many resources, so I just won't do this because it's too hard. But I think if you're very kind of smart about how you structure your workflows for building your art and stuff, you can come up with some of these little kind of environmental vignettes to use in your story. Thank you to